Okay, so today I'm going to model some annotation of some extracts from The Great Gatsby and from Jane Austen's Emma, and also from Notes on a Scandal. These are texts that we've been looking at to prepare for Year 13 coursework for English literature, where you've got to choose a pre-2000 novel and a post-2000 novel. So we're thinking about character, we're thinking about characterization and how we can do close analysis of an extract of text in order to show the skills of AO1, AO2, close analysis of style, and link that into an overarching theme or question that we're studying for coursework. Okay, so my first extract is going to be one from The Great Gatsby, and it's a description of Tom. It says he had changed since his New Haven years. So this is referring back to the college where both he and Nick were studying. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. So I'm going to just look at these descriptions here. Sturdy, hard, and supercilious. Now, what I think is interesting here is there's a number of references in the text to his physicality, and we're going to see a few mentions of that. But we also have words which give us a clue as to his personality. So there's a number of negative, pejorative words, hard and supercilious. And then it mentions the two shining arrogant eyes. So again, we've got a collection of words now that are linking into this really negative perception of this character. Had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forwards. So what we've got here is a number of words now that are building up a picture. What we would call this is a lexical grouping. Now, all that means is a group of words that are all coming together. So we've got hard, arrogant, dominance, and aggression, just to name a few. All these words are forming a group of words together to form a really strong picture of Tom, and it isn't a favourable one. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. Now, I just want to note here that the riding clothes is a hint of social status, because obviously only characters who are wealthy can take that kind of a hobby. And then we come back to the enormous power of that body. We come back to the idea of the physicality. So I'm linking to that idea that I've annotated already. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing and you could see a great pack of muscle. Somehow that description, which could be quite a nice description to be muscular, could be quite an attractive description, somehow pack of muscle makes it sound more almost primitive to me. It doesn't sound positive. Again, it's negative. Shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat, it was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So yet again, we've got reinforced in the narrator's perspective this negative perception of Tom. So the things that I'd say here are the narrator, who is Nick Carraway, clearly has a negative perception of Tom. And so when we see Tom characterized and described to us, we can pull out the accumulative effect of all of these words to create that negative perception. So we're not just looking at one or two words that seem to be a little bit negative. Here in this entire paragraph, we're seeing it reinforced again and again. Now, why is that significant? Well, when we think about how this fits into the arc of the story, we need to think about the role that Tom plays. Is Tom a kind of villain or an antagonist? Because if Tom is a villain or an antagonist, then this description is setting him up in that manner. Now, what's interesting in The Great Gatsby is it's a story of a number of characters in a high social status in 1920s jazz era America who, in some senses, are all suffering from a sort of grey morality. We could maybe say that there's a sense of they've all made it in terms of the American dream, but what has resulted is a sense of emptiness, a sense of amorality, a sense of the kind of laxness that comes with success. And so there's an atmosphere of everything being broken, and that's something that Tom himself is going to say in the first chapter, not far off from this extract, which is a surprising statement to make given that they're all seemingly successful. Okay, so that's our description of Tom. The next one we're going to look at is the description of Daisy, and we're going to see a clear contrast now in the description of her. Now, Daisy is a kind of second cousin once removed for Nick Carraway. So even though it says here about her being the cousin, there's definitely a sense of her being more distant, perhaps, than Nick is letting on here. He's already told us that it was a sort of second cousin removed. So I'm just going to put that in a question mark here. Nick is making her seem closer than she is, which the reason, may become apparent as we develop the story more. Who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. Now, I note here that one of the first adjectives that is being used for Daisy is positive. So we're going to start to see a really positive picture of Daisy that's coming through. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it. So I think the use of the word sad is evoking pathos for this character from the very start. And then the use of the word lovely, bright things in it, bright eyes, a bright, passionate mouth. Okay, so we've got a tripartite repetition here, and it is emphasizing the positive aspects of Daisy being this beautiful woman. I think the reference to the bright, passionate mouth has a subtext there. So subtext, the things which are perhaps more subtle and beneath the surface, I would say it's a suggestion of her sensuality, which will be a key thing in the story. There was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. Now, I think it's really interesting that he mentions men who had cared for her, because to me, implicit in that is a sense of Nick, the narrator, himself. He seems so positive about her, and he talks about all these other men who've cared for her. To me, it feels implicit that he's really talking about himself, but maybe doesn't want to admit that. And this kind of feeling of excitement around her, the exciting things that have happened before and may happen again, gives a sense of momentum for this character as she is introduced. A sense that Daisy is going to bring events into the story because she's a character that makes things happen. In a sense, Daisy could be seen as a catalyst, and she is a catalyst for the story as it's going to develop. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. Now, I think this is something I want to explore for the subtext again. The subtext here is that she is really pleased that people care about her, and that she's really pleased that people have asked after her and sent their love, and she's pleased that they miss her. So in a sense, she's pleased that they're upset that she's not there. Now, this hints to me at a kind of self-absorption, potentially a negative feature here. But the way that Nick, the narrator, frames it in all these positive things, I think, you blink and you miss it. It's the kind of one note of perhaps Daisy may not be the perfect, beautiful woman that Nick's presenting her as. There's also later on a description in the same scene of Nick mentioning that other people say that Daisy talks too quietly, deliberately, so that people have to lean in closer to hear what she says. And it's a throwaway comment, but again, it suggests in this desire for attention that Daisy has. Now, obviously, for coursework, you need to build a case for the things you argue about a character. And so, in a sense, one short quote like "lovely with bright things in it," is not going to be enough to build a case. But in the short space of this extract, which is only just over a paragraph long, we've got a lot of evidence, a bank of evidence to build up a case for Daisy being beautiful. There's a hint that there's something tragic with the sad note here in her face, but that she desires attention, and this may be a catalyst for events to happen in the novel. Okay, the next one we've got here is from Emma by Jane Austen, and this is from the opening chapter where Mr. Knightley has joined Emma and her father as they talk about Miss Taylor's marriage to Mr. Weston. By the by, I have not wished you joy, being pretty well aware of what sort of joy you must both be feeling. Now, here Mr. Knightley shows sensitivity to the fact that Emma and her father have just lost their governess. So even though the marriage is a happy affair, they are both feeling really sad that Miss Taylor, who's been a part of their family for so many years, has gone. And Mr. Knightley shows sensitivity to that. I have been in no hurry with my congratulations, but I hope it all went off tolerably well. How did you all behave, and who cried most? And what we've got here is a sense of a playful tone, familiarity, and that's going to be really important as the story unfolds, because Mr. Knightley's familiarity with Emma and her father mean that he's a character who's been there throughout Emma's childhood, and it means that she finds it harder to see him as a potential partner for herself because he's been part of the fabric of her family life. Poor Miss Taylor, 'tis a sad business. Now, this is the voice of Emma's father, Mr. Woodhouse, and what we really see here is his classic exaggerations. He always uses an exclamatory tone that we see through these exclamation marks, and that shows how he's got this nervous disposition and he's always seeing the worst in everything, a kind of hypochondria. Mr. Knightley responds, "Poor Mr. and Miss Woodhouse, if you please, but I cannot possibly say poor Miss Taylor. I have a great regard for you and Emma, but when it comes to the question of dependence or independence, at any rate it must be better to have only one to please than two." Now, this establishes Mr. Knightley as someone who is going to tell the truth. He's not going to pander to Mr. Woodhouse or Emma's fanciful notions. He's going to speak the truth. Of course, it's better for this governess to be married and have independence and not be living with a family anymore. So that's something which is clearly beneficial. "Especially when one of those two is such a fanciful, troublesome creature," said Emma playfully. Now again, we're seeing here the return of the playful tone that Mr. Knightley used right at the beginning. So is a sense of banter between the two characters. She's referring to herself, but she is kind of fishing for a bit of a compliment here, because she's suggesting that she is troublesome. And of course, what Emma hopes is that people will say to her, no, of course you're not troublesome. That is what you have in your head, I know, and what you'd certainly say if my father were not by. I believe it is very true, my dear, indeed, said Mr. Woodhouse with a sigh. I'm afraid I am sometimes very fanciful and troublesome. So here he completely misses the joke, and this gives us a sense of the fact that he's perhaps not intelligent enough to keep up with this banter that Emma and Mr. Knightley have. And it also perhaps creates some sympathy for Emma, because she's with this elderly father who doesn't get jokes, is not a very humorous, enjoyable person to be around. My dearest papa, you do not think I could mean you, or suppose Mr. Knightley to mean you? What a horrible idea. Oh no, I meant only myself. Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me, you know. In a joke, it is all a joke. We always say what we like to each other. Now, there's some important things to draw out here. First of all, Emma has this clear belief in her own superiority. And behind this supposedly self-deprecatory humour is actually perhaps a deeper truth that Emma doesn't really believe. We can see here self-deprecatory humour. You know, when people talk down about themselves, oh, I'm so terrible at this, I'm so terrible at that. But underneath it for Emma is a distinct belief in her own superiority. And so when she says it's a joke, all a joke, she's actually revealing how much she believes in her own superiority. Now, this line, we always say what we like to one another, reveals the intimacy of the friendship between Mr. Knightley and Emma, which obviously will become more important as the novel progresses. And then it says, Mr. Knightley, in fact, was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse. Now, this is a key thing, that Mr. Knightley is going to often be the voice of reason, the voice of truth in the novel, and he's someone who's going to steer Emma to self-awareness. Now, we've talked about this novel being a Bildungsroman, which basically means that it's a coming-of-age story. For Emma, she's going to learn more about herself, she's going to recognise her own flaws, and she's going to overcome them. And Mr. Knightley's going to be a key person to guide her. Her father's no use for that whatsoever. He was the only one who ever told her of them. Though this was not particularly agreeable to Emma herself, she knew it would be much less so to her father, that she would not have him really suspect such a circumstance as her not being thought perfect by everybody. And I think this is the problem, is that actually it's not just that everybody thinks Emma's perfect. The big problem is that Emma herself thinks she is. And throughout the novel, Emma's going to make a series of errors because she believes she's doing the right thing, and she doesn't have the humility to see that she may be wrong. Okay, now our next one and final one is from Notes on a Scandal, and we're looking at how Barbara presents Sheba here. This is where they first meet in the staff room. If Barbara ever left us, I'm afraid St. George's would collapse. Sheba looked at me carefully. She was about 35, I estimated. She was actually 40, about to be 41. Now, there's an important gap here in Barbara's estimation of Sheba's age and her actual age, because it suggests that Sheba is much younger looking than she actually is, which obviously sets up what's going to happen in the story, where she's going to have an affair with a young student. The hand that she held out to be shaken was large and red and somewhat coarse to the touch. "How nice to be so needed," she said, smiling. It was difficult to distinguish her tone, but it seemed to me that it contained a note of genuine sympathy, as if she understood how maddening it might be to be patronised by Mawson. Now, I think there's some interesting clues here. It was difficult to distinguish her tone. Barbara has problems in reading Sheba's voice, and it suggests that there may be an element of duplicity in Sheba right from the start of the novel, that she's someone who might deceive others. It says she understood how maddening it might be to be patronised, and that is going to be an important idea, that Sheba is often treated, for example, by her husband and patronised and looked down on by an older man because he's quite a lot older than her. Sheba. Is that as in queen of? I asked. You may have heard of the Queen of Sheba, biblical figure who's extremely wealthy who visits King Solomon. No, as in Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba is a really distinctive name, and it is loaded with lots of references that we're now going to go into. So, Barbara says, oh, were your parents thinking of the Bible or of Hardy? Now, these are the two main sources of this name Bathsheba. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about them so that you're clear. Okay, so first of all, in the Bible, Bathsheba is the lady who has an affair with King David. And it's a rather sorry affair where David summons her, he sees her bathing, he summons her, and then afterwards he arranges for her husband to be killed. So Bathsheba is a figure who is somewhat ambivalent because we don't know how much choice she had in the matter of going to King David or not. But what we do see from Bathsheba's conduct is that potentially she is a bit of a femme fatale. What I mean by that term is a kind of temptress woman, potentially. We're not entirely sure in the text itself, but the name is synonymous with this kind of affair, which is obviously going to be significant because this story is about an affair as well. Okay, then we've got Hardy. Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd is a novel at the centre of which is a female character called Bathsheba. And in this novel, it's a Victorian novel, Bathsheba basically inherits a farm and goes against the grain of the time by running the farm herself, getting very involved, paying her workers herself. And it's also her story of how she falls in love perhaps with the wrong person and suffers the consequences. So Far from the Madding Crowd is a great novel. It does have an eventual happy ending, but the heroine is very much dogged by doomed relationships, or particularly a doomed love for someone who doesn't return her affections in the same way. So without spoiling too much of that story, the link there is a kind of romantic link, but it isn't necessarily a positive one. She smiled. I'm not sure. I think they just like the name. So Sheba kind of just shrugs off the associations of her name, but I think it's highly significant that these two associations are brought in right at the start when we meet her. If there's anything you need to know about anything concerning this place, Sheba, Mawson continued, you must ask Barbara. She's the St. George's expert. Oh, smashing. I'll remember that, Sheba said. Now, it's interesting that Sheba's language, we know this is set in the 90s, but even so, her language still seems quite dated, quite posh. And then this leads Barbara on to say this. People from the privileged orders are always described as having plums in their mouths, but that wasn't what came to mind when I heard Sheba speak. Now, implicit in that is the fact that Sheba is from the privileged orders. In other words, Sheba is upper class. And that's going to become very significant as the story continues. It says, she doesn't talk like she's got a plum in her mouth. On the contrary, she sounded as if her mouth were very empty and clean, as if she'd never had a filling, which I think, again, is a really interesting description there, because it suggests a sense of purity. It suggests that she's never done anything wrong. She's never eaten too many sweets, for example, that she would need to have a filling. So what we're left with is a really nuanced presentation of Sheba here, with clear hints that there could be a sensuality to her, a deception to her, and this higher class status, which may become very significant later in the novel. I guess the big question then is, once you've made your annotation, how you then draw it all together and actually write a response. So I think the key questions to summarise when you're making your annotation is to think about the introduction of a character into the novel. A novel is a long text and it can be really daunting to know where to start. But looking at the first introduction of a character is always really interesting to see what things the narrator is setting up for later on in the story. So we saw how the introduction of Mr. Knightley as a figure who always tells Emma the truth is going to be something important as the novel progresses. It's also worth thinking about the perspective of the narrator and how that influences how a character is presented. Is there a subtext beneath what the narrator tells us to read as well? So we've seen in The Great Gatsby how Nick seems to have a predisposition to favour Daisy, and that's clearly reflected in the positive terms of his language when he describes her. However, there is a subtext beneath what Nick tells us which suggests there's another side to Daisy, and we might want to watch her quite closely as the story unfolds. You might want to consider how characters represent ideas or concepts or even themes in the novel. Daisy might represent sensuality. In what ways might Sheba in Notes on a Scandal represent sensuality or taboo love? Finally, the most important thing is to look at the response of the reader to the character. When you are introduced to this character, do you like them? Do you dislike them? How do you respond to the character? And how has the writer shaped that response in their language and imagery and in the way that character's been presented?